Off. Moments from now, the House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler will brief reporters. Nadler today is going to court to enforce subpoenas against the Trump White House. That action part of the big debate over how, when, or if Democrats should move on impeachment. Just last hour, the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi denied that she's trying to stall.
No, I'm not trying to run out the clock. Let's get sophisticated about this, okay? Okay?
But how long do you think these court fights will take?
We will proceed when we have what we need to proceed, not one day sooner. Their advocacy for impeachment only gives me leverage. I have no complaint with what they are doing. I'm willing to take whatever heat there is there to say when the decision will be made in a timely fashion. This isn't endless.
But the clock is ticking. The number of Democrats who support opening an impeachment inquiry is now at 96. Judiciary Committee Democrats, including the chairman, have debated opening an inquiry without Speaker Pelosi on board. Pelosi met this morning with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, another show of outreach, and an attempt to paper over big and very public rifts with the New York freshman. In this post-meeting picture, you see it there, all smiles, and a promise from Pelosi to work together. But a clear message from Pelosi afterwards to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and others who want to beat the impeachment drum: don't do it.
Democrats intend to own August to make so many of the bills that we passed too hot to handle for the Republicans in the Senate not to raise the minimum wage or end gun violence by common sense gun violence prevention measures. The list, equal pay for equal work. The list goes on and on. A drumbeat across America. Lower health care costs, bigger paychecks, cleaner government.
Let's get straight to Capitol Hill and CNN's Manu Raju. Manu, the sophisticated reporter who's been on this beat all along. Manu, what do you make of what Pelosi has been trying to do with this press conference, closing out the end of this week after the big Mueller hearing and going off to now what'll be a 6-week recess?
Well, she's trying to frame their message in August, and one thing that she does not want to be talking about is the issue of impeachment, which a number of her members, of course, are now agitating about. Now, when you talk to a number of Democrats, they make clear that their concerns are that the window could be closing to moving forward on an impeachment probe because of the calendar. They are moving to the 6-week recess. Then there's not many legislative days left in 2019. Then we head into 2020, where the election season will get into full swing, and it gets much harder to do complicated things in an election season, such as impeachment. So the question that I try to pose to her is whether or not her current strategy of moving to the courts, which she has now been advocating, is an attempt to essentially run out the clock, as some Democrats believe, given her resistance to moving forward. She tried to make clear that she is not simply trying to run out the clock. And interestingly, they're saying that she has political leverage in the people who are calling for an impeachment as she resists it, suggesting that perhaps if she were to change her position, it would be a much stronger call, given that she has said so far that she would not be open to moving forward. But trying to pin her down on exactly what that means in terms of her time frame is unclear as well. I tried to ask her whether or not these court fights, how long it could take. She said, well, it would not be endless. And then when another reporter asked if it would be is it a drop-dead date, she would not say there. But in a matter of moments, we're going to hear from the House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler, and we'll hear what he has to say about his next steps as well.
And Nancy Pelosi is sort of setting the table from what we'll hear from Chairman Nadler, as you say, moments from now. Thank you, Manu. We'll toss back to you when Nadler appears here with me to share their reporting and their insights. Sunmin Kim with the Washington Post, Julie Hirschfield Davis with the New York Times, Laura Barron Lopez with Politico, and Catherine Lucy with the Wall Street Journal. We saw there Nancy Pelosi ending this week. We probably won't hear from her much or many of these other members. They're splitting town for 6 weeks. Nancy Pelosi there, Julie Hirschfield Davis, really trying to bury the hatchet with Pelosi. This has been a big fight that they've had. I'm sort of surprised that they hadn't really met much before. What do you make of this? Is this going to work?
Well, I mean, I think you're totally right that she's trying to sort of have this sense of unity going into the recess. And actually, there is, I think, when you talk to members, there's a lot more unity today than there was last week and even 2 weeks ago, when she was, very openly feuding with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and these other freshman women who often vote with her. And so some of that has dissipated. There still are, substantive differences on impeachment, on policy, but they do go out of Washington, I think, this week on somewhat of a high, having passed this budget agreement with a lot of unity. They lost 16 Democrats on that deal that passed yesterday. That was, a lot fewer than at some points they thought they might have had. And they can point to an agenda where she has managed to keep people pretty unified, but that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be behind the scenes fighting, and I think that we're going to continue to see that going forward. I think they were just able to end on a friendlier note today.
Yeah, and here's what she had to say in terms of whether or not there was an attempt to bury the hatchet between her and AOC.
I don't think there ever was any hatchet. I would never even say that it was a hatchet, but I do think that we sat down today, we had a good meeting, and the Congresswoman is a very gracious member of Congress. I've always felt, again, it's like you're in a family. In a family, you have your differences, but you're still a family.
Laura, no hatchet to see here. Nancy Pelosi saying there about her relationship with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. This has been a bitter feud, right? You had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other members of the so-called squad feeling that they'd been disrespected by Nancy Pelosi.
Right, and they were very vocal about that, and they were tweeting repeatedly about this, and there were feuds going on between staffers, and we saw Pelosi do the interview with Maureen Dowd, which also set off another round of this by her saying that she didn't think they had that much support, that this squad wasn't actually that powerful in the caucus, and so it definitely was, I would say, a hatchet, or it was a bigger feud than Pelosi wants to let on. Yeah. And we are seeing, though, as Julie mentioned, that it seems that everything has quieted down a lot heading into this August recess, and it was not like that just a matter of
And part of the feud, obviously, all about impeachment. You heard Pelosi there essentially saying she doesn't really feel that much pressure, and whatever pressure she does feel actually gives her leverage. But here was Jackie Speer essentially saying, listen, the clock is ticking.
If we don't take action come September 1st, then we should just shut it down, because we're not going to be able to do anything at all. I feel strongly that we should, but I think we're running out of time.
96 at this point, House Democrats for opening an impeachment inquiry. Jackie Speer in that same interview also said she feels like there are 30 or so other members of the House Democratic Caucus who are also for impeachment but are kind of not being as vocal about it. Is that your sense as well?
Well, I think a lot of times, especially for those 30 or so members that you mentioned, you do need a little bit of cover from the leadership to say, okay, this is okay to say, go out there and say you support opening an inquiry. And you're starting to get a little bit of that. I thought Representative Catherine Clark, who is a member of leadership, come out yesterday saying she does support opening impeachment proceedings was a pretty notable and significant move. Also remember, 96 is less than half of the Democratic caucus, but more than half of the Judiciary Committee actually supports opening an impeachment inquiry. So that's why you see that friction, the private friction between Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Chairman Jerry Nadler, who I think if he had his own druthers, he would have already gone forward with it by now. We'll look at his tone in his press conference coming up, but that's a tension, and that open question of whether the committee is even contemplating moving forward on its own is a really important one to watch.
And here is what Nadler had to say this morning about impeachment.
What if the administration defies these court orders that you believe are imminent?
Well, without question, no administration has ever defied a court order. If they did that, that is so far beyond the pale that is totally eliminating the rule of law. There'd have to be an impeachment.
And we'll, of course, hear from Nadler later today, Catherine.
Yes, and I think one of the things to look to as this fight continues is members in some of the more moderate districts. Those are the people that Pelosi is really trying to give a certain amount of cover to. People who
like Joe Cunningham,
people who flipped districts from Republican to Democrat, who aren't interested in walking so far out in this. I was just in Michigan this week talking to voters in the suburbs of Detroit, and you're not hearing a lot of talk about impeachment, about Mueller, about some of these things.
Often on the campaign trail too, right? Yeah. When you're covering these presidential candidates. Laura, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, because two more, as we're sitting here, just came out for impeachment, two more House Democrats. Mike Levin of California, he's actually in a swing district, one that Democrats just flipped last cycle, and also Ann Kuster, who's in New Hampshire. So we're seeing more and more, probably getting pretty close to 100 in the next few days.
In some ways, it wasn't the flood, I think, that people wanted and hoped
Right,
for
right.
after the Mueller hearing, but certainly some flipped.
Right. I mean, I think definitely members that I've talked to in the last couple days since the testimony have said that they did think it was somewhat of a turning point, one way or the other. But I do think it's important to look at what Nancy Pelosi said in that news conference, which I think is really true. This is not necessarily a problem for her. Every member who comes out and says they're in favor of this, it essentially builds the case for, well, if you don't cooperate in court, I've got people who are ready to impeach you tomorrow, you know. So as much as this drumbeat increases, I think there's a possibility that it could actually be helpful to her and helpful to the litigation prerogatives of the House.
Julie, we're going to have to end it there. Nadler is coming to the mics here, and we're going to bring you this. Here he is, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler.
We all here? Good afternoon. I am joined today by many of my colleagues from the House Judiciary Committee. We want to say a few words about Director Mueller, what we learned from his testimony, and next steps in our work to hold President Trump accountable for his conduct. Robert Mueller is a man of honor and integrity. He has led a life defined by service to his country. Some have argued that because Director Mueller was reluctant to testify and seemed older than some remembered him, his work is somehow diminished. It is not. Before he ever stepped into our hearing room, the director had rendered our country a great and necessary public service. He showed through his report and his indictments that the United States was attacked and remains under siege by a foreign adversary. He showed that the Trump campaign both welcomed and benefited from this attack on our country. And he showed that the president repeatedly lied to cover it up. And if that were not enough, Director Mueller's testimony removed all doubt. He told us that Donald Trump obstructed justice and abused his office by tampering with witnesses, attempting to block the investigation, and attempting to fire the special counsel. He told us that Donald Trump lied to the public about the Trump Tower meeting in New York, lied to the public about his plans for Trump Tower in Moscow, and lied in his written responses to the special counsel. He told us in a remarkable exchange with Mr. Liu that but for the Department of Justice policy from prohibiting from doing so, he would have indicted President Trump. Indeed, it is clear that any other citizen of this country who behaved as the president has would have been charged with multiple crimes. Notably, my Republican colleagues were unable to refute a single one of these facts. So where do we go from here? We will continue to seek testimony from key fact witnesses. As many of you know, the committee has authorized several additional subpoenas. Our work will continue into the August recess, and we will use those subpoenas if we must. We will also continue to seek important documents from the Department of Justice and the White House. We have made some progress on this front. There appears to be compelling evidence of the president's misconduct outside of the four corners of the redacted version of the Mueller report, and we will work to uncover that evidence as well. Finally, today, we are filing an application for the grand jury material underlying the Mueller report. That information is critically important for our ability to examine witnesses, including former White House counsel Don McGahn, and to investigate the president's misconduct. I will not comment on reports of our ongoing negotiations with Mr. McGahn, but unless he complies with our accommodation efforts in very short order, we expect to file an additional suit to enforce our subpoena for his testimony. And that will be next week, or earlier next week. I should note that the committee could not have brought these lawsuits without the help and support of Speaker Pelosi, who is as dedicated to holding this president accountable for his crimes as any of us gathered here today. Before I take your questions, let me share just a few sentences from the petition we are filing with the court today. Quote, because Department of Justice policies will not allow prosecution of a sitting president, the United States House of Representatives is the only institution of the federal government that can now hold President Trump accountable for these actions. To do so, the House must have access to all the relevant facts and consider whether to exercise its full Article I powers, including a constitutional duty power of the utmost gravity, recommendation of articles of impeachment. That duty falls in the first instance to the House Committee on the Judiciary. Close quote. As I said, that was from the court filing today. We take that responsibility seriously. No one can be above the law, not even President Trump. We'll now take some questions.
So half of the members up here
And let me just say, we take questions when they ask members of the committee to field the questions as well. Go ahead.
half of the members up here have come out in support of impeachment. How are you dealing with disagreements with the speaker on that issue? And especially heading into this 6-week-long recess, do you expect that those divisions to go away soon?
I don't know that there are real divisions with the Speaker. I would refer you to her earlier comments in which she said that we must make the strongest case. If our committee is going to recommend articles of impeachment to the House, we must make the strongest possible case both to our colleagues and to the American public. On that, we're in total agreement.
So could there be a point, though, Mr. Chairman, where you break from the Speaker and you announce publicly your support for impeachment?
We are, as I said, and as is clear in the court filings, we are exercising our full Article I authority. We are continuing investigation of the president's malfeasances, and we will do what we feel, and we will consider what we have to consider, including whether we should recommend articles of impeachment to the House. That's the job of our committee. We may decide to recommend articles of impeachment at some point. We may not. That remains to be seen. And there's no point speculating on whether the Speaker or anybody else will agree with our decision at that point.
What's holding you back from publicly voicing your support for impeachment inquiry?
Well, if I can jump in, I mean, impeachment.
Can you speak to the microphone?
Sorry, thank you. Okay. Impeachment isn't a binary thing that you either are or you aren't. What we've been saying and what we've been doing is starting a process where we're engaging in an investigation to see if we should recommend articles of impeachment. It's a process. We started it some months ago in some ways while waiting for the report and holding the hearings that we've already had. So, it's an ongoing process. The court filings today are the next step, and we'll continue down that road, to see whether we have the strong case that is needed to put to the American people.
Chairman Nadler, what about the idea here, though, that at the hearing yesterday, on Wednesday here, Speaker Pelosi said that they crossed a threshold, called this historic. What did Robert Mueller fail to do? Obviously, you said that he should not be diminished by his presentation. But what would you have liked to gotten out of him in that presentation on Wednesday?
He didn't fail to do anything. Yesterday,
He
2
didn't
days
fail
ago.
to animate this. We heard that repeatedly from members on your side of the aisle that he failed to breathe life into that report.
Well, if you showed up expecting a Broadway show, sure, you may have been disappointed. But if you listened to what he said that the Russians attacked us. They had a preference for Donald Trump. The Trump campaign welcomed it and planned around it. And when the police investigated it, they took great lengths to cover it up, including the president. And the president is the only person in America who would be shielded from being held accountable because of what they did. That is pretty cut and dry. And what you've seen is not members who have called for impeachment saying, take me off of that call in light of what Mr. Mueller has said. 6 members since have come forward and have said, add me to that call for impeachment.
Please.
I'm sorry. The one thing Robert Mueller failed to do in that hearing is he failed to exonerate the president. In fact, he said he could not exonerate the president. So That, I think, is the answer to your question.
When members answer, why don't you identify yourselves? That's Mary Gay Scanlon.
May I just add an extra point
Sheila Jackson.
on, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Throughout the entire time of Mr. Mueller's presence before the House Judiciary Committee, he evidenced elements of a crime. He was not in any way shortchanging his answers that crimes had been committed. He said yes to the 3 elements of obstruction. He said yes that one element of obstruction could result in jail time. He also said that, when I say said, answered questions that said you did not have to have an underlying crime to be able to be convicted of obstruction. I don't think the American people have ever heard that in that manner before. I know there are some who may have read both volumes, but they never heard it as it was played out with the members of this committee, that when you finished the Judiciary Committee's questioning, and when you started with Chairman Nadler, who did an enormous job on framing our questioning by getting right to the meat of the issue of obstruction and then exoneration, which Director Mueller openly and I think quite vividly said that he was not the president exonerated. And then we continued methodically to reinforce that to the extent that the elements of obstruction, which I wanted to just mention here for a moment, an obstructive act, a nexus between the act and an official proceeding, and corrupt intent, was associated with the actions of this president. The American people have never heard that. And I will close by simply saying on this question that you asked, for those of us who've seen Director Mueller before this committee on a number of years as FBI director, he has always been stoic and a former Marine, just right to the point. He certainly has an enormous talent of investigation. So when he came today, or yesterday, on Wednesday, he made true of what he said to the committee. He was going to stick with the report. He did that. But in doing so, every single question that would warrant someone being convicted of a crime was answered.
Steve Cohen.
Thank you. I'd just like to add one thing that I think's been overlooked. Mr. Mueller made a point of saying, in a response to a question from Mr. Buck, which I think he probably would like to have taken back, that the president could be indicted after he left office. Now, Mr. Mueller earlier said, and it may be in the report, that one of the reasons to get all that information was to get it from witnesses while it was fresh in their mind and preserve it for later use. If you didn't believe you had a criminal act, why would you want to preserve the evidence? So by the very fact that he preserved the evidence and said it was necessary to get these people while it was fresh in their mind and their best recollection, meant that he's basically saying he obstructed justice and the time may have to come after his first term, or his last term, which would be his first term.
Let me just summarize one thing here. I believe that the hearing with Director Mueller was an inflection point. It was an inflection point because it accomplished 2 things. One, you heard Director Mueller say that we were attacked by the Russians, that the Trump campaign welcomed the attack, welcomed the assistance of the Russians, that the substantial evidence of crimes of obstruction of government, obstruction of justice by the president, and that he was not exonerated, and that the mantra that the president and the attorney general have been telling the country for months now, that they found no collusion, no obstruction, and the president was totally exonerated, was totally untrue. It changed that. Even you heard the president now saying that the investigation was treasonous. He wouldn't be saying that if he still thought he could get away with saying the investigation established no obstruction, no collusion, and totally exonerated him. So he broke the lie that has been propagated by the Attorney General and by the President, and we can and presented to the American people the stark conclusions which we can now fill out by getting other evidence and getting the witnesses and so forth.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman.
Madeline Dean from Pennsylvania. I just wanted to say two things. One, about the performance of Mr. Mueller. I have nothing but the highest regard for Mr. Mueller and his life of service to this country. And what I believe we really should be focused on is not the performance of Mr. Mueller, but the performance or behaviors of this president obstructing justice. That's the performance you need to be examining. The performance of the Trump administration welcoming, wallowing in interference by Russia. The performance of Russia interfering with our elections in massive and sweeping ways that will continue. And a Senate yesterday that did nothing, in fact, blocked attempts to take care of or protect our elections. Those are the performances we need to be looking at. Those are the behaviors. Trump, his campaign, Russia, and obstruction. That's what we need to be looking at.
Mr. Chairman, you've been fighting for these grand jury materials for some time, but you've also been engaging in an accommodation process with the Department of Justice. They've allowed you to view some documents. Even in a May letter, you said you've made clear you're not seeking from the department any information or documents that are properly subject to Rule 60 to grand jury materials. So why is this material so important to you? What do you think you will find, and will that hurt the accommodation process you already have with the department for these other documents you want?
Well, we have been engaged in accommodation processes with the Justice Department, with various other witnesses, to get testimony and to get documents and so forth. It has been largely fruitless, but it is necessary to do that if you're going to go into court to enforce your subpoenas, which we're doing. With respect to 6E, that is to say grand jury testimony, we have not requested it previously. You have to go to court and request it. In previous cases, the special prosecutor, the committee went into court and requested this 20 years ago, 40 years ago, and the Attorney General went into court and supported the application. This time, we're going into court today. I don't expect the Attorney General to support the application. Indeed, he may oppose it. But we have to see the underlying grand jury material of a lot of things about the Mueller report, which will be very informative to us.
But doesn't this set a dangerous precedent if this were to get leaked out? Why is this information so important?
The information is important, and I can't characterize the specific importance because I don't know the specific contents, obviously, because it's at the foundation. Much of the investigation by the special prosecutor or the special counsel was in the form of grand jury presentations, and that's what and you have to see that. And in the case of Leanne Jaworski and Ken Starr, the committee in both cases was given that information, was given access to that information, and we need that information too to make a lot of different judgments.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, there's a vigorous debate in your caucus about whether or not to formally open an impeachment inquiry. Given what you've said about this filing, comments that you've made in hearings in recent weeks, are you all beginning to shade into an impeachment inquiry, even if you haven't held the formal vote of the House? Is that what's going on here?
What's going on?
You're on your own there. We don't need it.
What's going on is that I think too much has been made of the phrase an impeachment inquiry. We are doing what our court filing says we are doing, what I said we are doing, and that is to say we are using our full Article I powers to investigate the conduct of the president and to consider what remedies there are. Among other things, we will consider obviously whether to recommend articles of impeachment. We may not do that. We may do that, but that's the conclusion at the end of the process. You may want to call that an inquiry or not. I think people, when they think of an inquiry, think of a formal House vote to direct the committee to hold an inquiry. That's happened in the past, but there have also been instances where it didn't happen. The committee is exercising its authority to investigate all these scandals and to decide what to do about them, which could include articles of impeachment. And we filed that with the court, and we told that to the court, and we're going to do that.
Do you believe that you already are at that point of an inquiry? Do you believe what the Judiciary Committee is doing right now is an inquiry into impeachment?
We are doing exactly what I said a moment ago we are doing. That is to say, we are examining and investigating the various malfeasances and crimes and so forth of the president. We are going into court and asking for more information and to enforce our subpoenas. We are telling the court that we are doing this not just as part of normal oversight, but also because as part of our Article 1 authority and responsibility to consider all remedies, including possibility of articles of impeachment, and that's what we're going to do. Now, whether you call that an inquiry or whatever you want to call that, it's what we've been doing and we are doing and will continue to do.
Mr. Chairman, the court battle could take a little bit of time. Do you have a deadline, even if it's expedited, it could take a while. Do you have a deadline in your mind as to when you all will make this decision, and would you
Well,
do this
first
in
of
an
all, it's
election
not
year?
this decision, a lot of different decisions, and no, I don't.
Mr. Nadler, you mentioned the idea of having the strongest possible case before you go to court, but isn't the strongest possible case to get 6E material being in an impeachment inquiry?
The strongest possible case is to tell the court what we're telling the court, which you'll see in the court. I think we're going to give you copies of the court filings, and I quoted part of the relevant paragraph, and that is that we are. I'll read it again. The House must have access to all relevant facts, consider whether to exercise its full Article 1 powers, including a constitutional power of the utmost gravity, recommendation of articles of impeachment. That falls in the first instance to the House Committee on the Judiciary. What we are telling the court, and one of the purposes of telling the court is to say we are exercising our highest authority, is that we are considering the malfeasances of the president. We're considering what remedies we can do, including the possibility of articles of impeachment.
Mr. Chairman, in your opening...
There's Chairman Jerry Nadler, the House Judiciary Committee, flanked by some of his members, all of whom actually are for opening an impeachment inquiry. We're going to bring it back to the table here. One of the things that struck me about this was in some ways an attempt to sort of rehabilitate Robert Mueller's testimony. You had Nadler there open up by saying just because he seemed older, it didn't diminish the work and what he presented there. What did you make of that, Sunday?
I thought that was a really interesting line, and it caught my attention right away. There was another one of his members who also said, don't kind of look at how Mueller was saying this, look at the substance of the report and the conduct of the Trump administration, because I think that is what that is something that had gotten lost a little bit after the Mueller hearing. I think a lot of us were struck by just how a little uneven the special counsel seemed, which was something else that we focused on. So I think they're trying to steer it back to the substance. They're trying to steer it back to the fact that, look, the special counsel did say specifically that the president was not exonerated. He confirmed a lot of parts in his report, and they just want to bring it back to the substance and not the style.
Mm-hmm. But I also think it was extremely significant that the chairman kept on referring to using our full Article 1 powers, and that language is actually in this lawsuit that's being filed today. Article 1 is the article of the Constitution that gives the House the power to impeach the president. So even though he sidestepped my colleagues and another reporter's question about whether Nadler believes that in effect the Judiciary Committee already is in an impeachment inquiry, that is essentially the case that he's making without outright saying
making it. Yeah, when the question came up, he kind of looked around.
Anyone else want to take that one? But that is essentially the case that he's making without coming out directly and saying it.
And we also know, Politico reported on Wednesday that Nadler in a closed-door meeting was urging Pelosi and others to pursue impeachment proceedings and to get the ball rolling. So he's towing this fine line right now because he knows he's close with Pelosi. He knows that he doesn't want to overstep and go around her, but he very much, and all those members that were standing behind him, support impeachment. So.
And he made it clear there in his statement. He said, listen, Pelosi basically wants to hold the president accountable too, and she supports all the work of this committee, basically to the point that you're making there. Catherine, what did you make of Jerry Nadler there and the comments from members of his committee? They made it clear that the work, even though they're going on recess, the work's going to continue.
Yeah, they were very clear that this continues. They are looking for more materials. I mean, this is an escalation of the process, even though they are still trying to say, we're still looking at this, nothing's been decided. And I mean, I'm sure we will hear soon from the president on this. He has been very quick to respond when he feels like he's being pushed on this impeachment issue.
We heard from him last night. Obviously, we know it's Hannity misrepresenting actually what came out of the hearings, but I'm sure we'll hear more from him on Twitter. Up next, Kamala Harris unveils 2 policies aimed at helping minorities, but new polls indicate she has some work to do to expand her support. Kamala Harris is rolling out 2 big policy proposals today, both aimed at African Americans. The California Democrat wants $60 billion to be invested in STEM education at historically black colleges. She's also calling on Congress to funnel $12 billion to go towards helping minority-run small businesses. These are just the latest proposals Harris has unveiled as part of her, quote, black agenda, though notably the campaign would not signal to CNN how exactly they'd be paid for. Here's how she described her vision at a speech before the National Urban League just a short time ago.
We're going from when the doors to many of our country's prestigious colleges and professions were being closed to our community and to the new investments that educate the next generation of black leaders. We're going from redlining to real opportunity for home ownership. We're going from being excluded from the first industrial revolution to propelling the next one. And Urban League, let's be clear, by taking these challenges on, we don't just move Black America forward, all of America moves forward. All of America will benefit.
And Laura, this is just a small part of her black agenda. She's rolled out any number of other policy initiatives around her black agenda, including combating maternal mortality and healthcare bias, decriminalizing marijuana and expunging past drug-related convictions, increasing diversity in STEM education, which is part of what this initiative is today. And this is something she has focused on. We haven't necessarily seen it show up in the polls in terms of how she's doing with African Americans and other minorities, but it's a clear focus of hers.
Yeah, we've seen more attention being devoted to Harris since the debates, but this has been a central theme of her campaign from the beginning. Months ago, early on this year, a speech that she gave in Michigan, she very much hit back against the electability question, back against the fact that, there isn't enough attention being paid to black and brown voters, and saying pretty much in a way subtly then taking jabs at candidacies like Biden's, which is much more focused on not overtly talking about race and focusing on the Midwest and other voters that white rural voters that flipped to Trump last time. So her candidacy, as well as Warren's, they're very much trying to aggressively talk about black and brown voters and how their policies would specifically help them, because they think that'll be successful.
And one of the trends you saw in 2016 was a real dip in terms of African American turnout. It was down, the rate of African American turnout, which had been at historic levels with Obama, dropped about 7 percentage points in 2016. A lot of African American voters in those states that Trump ended up winning, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, some of them didn't show up.
Absolutely. I mean, you have voters in, if you look at Philadelphia, at Detroit, at Milwaukee, they did not see the same kind of turnout as they did under Obama. And I think that's one of the questions going into this as Democrats try to figure out the best way to build a winning coalition. Can you boost those numbers? Right. Can you get them up? As President Trump is also making a play for African American voters. We've heard him talking about the criminal justice legislation that he's backed, other types of yes, other efforts
to be part of it.
But if you are on his side, there is an argument that if this is an election won on the margins, then making those kinds of appeals, getting a % or two, could matter.
And you see this fight between Biden and Booker too, which also seems to be over African American voters, centered on criminal justice reform. A lot of the polls still showing Biden with a pretty commanding lead. There was a Fox News poll; he's at 33%. The rest of the field, essentially half that. Bernie Sanders 15%. Cory Booker at 2%. But they have been going at it.
Well, Booker really needs to be able to grab some attention considering his standing in the polls there, and he's certainly going to have a chance to do that next week when he will be he'll be with the former vice president at the debate. The criminal justice reform is really a fascinating, fault line for a lot of these Democrats, because we've seen how the former vice president had come under so much criticism for his role in the '94 crime bill, and the fact that this and also healthcare to a similar extent are the ones where he really are the issues that has really prompted Biden to punch back at a lot of his Democratic opponents. He's been singling out Bernie Sanders, a little bit of hints at Kamala Harris over healthcare and their push for a Medicare for all system, and definitely on criminal justice reform with Booker. You could argue that if once Booker punched, she had to kind of punch back.
Right.
But it'll be really interesting to see those contrasts. And going back to Catherine's point, criminal justice reform is an actual area where President Trump does have an accomplishment to run on. I mean, last week the Justice Department announced that more than 3,000 people have been released under the First Step Act. So it'll be really interesting to see that matchup in general election and how that issue plays out.
And Biden obviously just rolling out his criminal justice reform plan, because that is going to dog him. And we'll see the debate next week. Democratic candidate.
We were promised a rising tide that would lift all boats. Sure enough, GDP went up, businesses boomed, the stock market grew over decades, but our paychecks didn't show it. Our incomes have basically stayed flat. That is why today I'm sharing a plan that fights to get Americans the pay raise we deserve.
Does America deserve a raise?
Yeah! That's Mayor Pete Buttigieg making his pitch to voters on the economy ahead of the CNN debates. The 2020 candidate directly takes on big tech companies like Google, Uber, and Lyft, while putting labor unions front and center. Vanessa Yurkevich, she's covering Buttigieg's campaign for CNN. Vanessa, lay out exactly what Mayor Pete is trying to do with this new plan.
Hi, Nia. Well, he's really trying to put workers' rights front and center, as well as put big tech companies in the hot seat. Now, this plan is very comprehensive. I just want to know a couple of highlights from the plan for people to take note of. It guarantees all American workers the right to join a union, introduces multi-million-dollar penalties for employer interference in union elections and workers' rights, and it allows workers to collectively bargain with their direct parent companies. And as you mentioned, in that plan, he names 3 big tech companies, Uber, Lyft, and Google. These companies employ contracted workers more in favor of full-time employees. So those contracted independent workers don't get the same rights and benefits as those full-time workers. Pete Buttigieg, under this plan, wants to allow those independent workers to unionize and collective bargain. Now, I asked him last night in an exclusive phone interview I had with him ahead of this rollout, is he really willing to take on big tech? And he said, yes, he was. Also, Nia, of interest, his big fundraising of this quarter, the second quarter, about $25 million. A lot of that money came from Silicon Valley. A lot of the people he raised money from were these Silicon Valley executives. And now he is rolling out this proposal aimed directly at them. Nia?
Yeah, that's really interesting there. Vanessa, thanks for that report. We'll bring it to the table here. We got about 90 seconds. Julie, what do you make of this? He talked about the idea that he's been able to raise this money. He still hasn't gained much traction with voters. He's about 5%, I think, in the latest polls I've seen.
Right, if only his dollars could be actual poll numbers. I think it's pretty clear here. I mean, he said from the outset that he wanted to try to appeal to these voters that are not necessarily have left the Democratic Party, and essentially Democrats know they have to appeal to the white working class, and become again what in many places they are no longer, which is the party of unions, the party of working people. And so I think this plan is clearly focused on trying to really win over those voters at a time when President Trump is trying to tout the economy and his popularity with working people as a selling point. And so I think he's really trying to focus in on that group of voters that Democrats have had a little bit of trouble attracting in the last cycle.
And going after big tech, also a theme in this Democratic primary, primarily I think from somebody like Elizabeth Warren, who's made that a centerpiece of her campaign.
Yeah, she's been very aggressive about that. Sanders as well has talked extensively about that. And again, I think we're seeing from Buttigieg this effort to try to catch up in a way, because he has been slow to release these very detailed policy plans, which was a criticism early on of him. And now as they're getting into these debates, and he's very much likely going to make the fall debate, he has to start putting more meat on the bone.
And he's probably going to make a lot of the debates because of his fundraising numbers. He's going to probably be able to stay in this thing.
Yeah, he's certainly moved into the sort of upper tier of candidates at this point. But I think in terms of targeting voters in these states, targeting union voters, he's got competition there. A number of other candidates in this primary are really, I mean, most notably, obviously, Joe Biden, but also Bernie Sanders. There are lots of people really trying to make a play for those voters that are seen as, kind of key people that strayed from the Democratic Party in the last election.
Yeah, and we'll see what he does in next week's debate, Tuesday and Wednesday, next week in Detroit, of course, on CNN. Thanks for joining us on Inside Politics. John King is back here Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern. Brianna Keeler starts after a quick break.